Thank you, Alan, and let me say I'm delighted to be with you this morning. I just wanted to say in advance that I have to catch a flight a little before noon, so I'm going to probably have to leave here shortly after 10 o'clock. So if there are questions that would have been addressed to me, my colleague Larry Lanham, who is in the audience, has agreed to, put on some hair and look like me, or not much hair and look like me, and he'll field any of the questions that you might have, because I think he's perfectly able to do that. So what I'd like to do in the 7 minutes that we've been allotted for the presentation is to tell you a little bit about open architecture, sort of where it's going, how it relates to the internet, and something about the lessons that we learned about managing a critical piece of this whole infrastructure that's led us to set up a nonprofit organization in Switzerland that I think could be relevant to the efforts of the RDA going forward. We've had a lot of experience in dealing with the IETF, which we had established Secretariat for many years ago. I think Scott is going to talk about that. But a lot of the lessons that we learned there are going to be relevant here, especially if the RDA doesn't want to become a big establishment of its own with buildings and legal entities and tax filings and all the like. So I think the RDA wants to have its own independence and be able to set its own agenda, but it may need some structural support, and I think the foundation that we're talking about might be a good choice in that context. So if you have questions about that, we can deal with it. So let me get set here and have to point it at something. There we go. So first of all, I wanted to say a little bit about what it took to make the internet happen and evolve it, and sort of how to think about it. And the first point I want to make is that it's an open architecture. That means it's got defined interfaces, protocols, and objects that flow. And I think this kind of notion is going to be very important for anybody dealing in the data field. Now, the research data community is particularly privileged, and you've got some of the best minds and the most inventiveness. So you could actually set the standard for virtually every other discipline that wants to make use of data if you set your standards right. So I would encourage that. The notion of the internet, a lot of people like this, they say it's a network, but in fact what it was a logical abstraction. The internet was not about any particular network technology, it was not about any particular computer, it was not about any particular operating system, it was about a strategy for causing these things to work together, and it was by managing the flow of information that the internet really achieves its powers through the protocols and procedures. I think that's the same thing we need to do in the research data context as well. And we have some notions of that. We've talked about it in some of the groups. Various reports that come out will address pieces of it. It won't be exactly as we formulated it because it was a group effort to try and put it in common terms. So we think of the internet as a global information system, but in the original context, the information was about communications, how to make sure data in one place got to another. And now we can see it being elevated to a much, much larger context. So I wanted to put up one definition here, which I think is interesting. This was a definition that the U.S. Federal Networking Council adopted in the mid-1990s as to what the internet was. They defined it as a global information system. They didn't say it was a network or a network of networks that was logically linked together by this globally unique address space. Those are the kind of linchpins. These were IP addresses or subsequent extensions or follow-ons. So they made the assumption that this might actually extend in the future. Can support protocols and communications using either the TCP/IP component or extension followers or other IP compatible protocols. So things like the web clearly could fit into that paradigm as well as to what it's able to support. And finally, that it took the more holistic view that it also included all of the high-level services that could be layered onto it. Now, in this particular picture, I said, anybody would, that was an add-on that I made, and I wanted to say why I think that's important, because I think the way that you evolve these kind of systems is not always by layering. you sometimes need to go into the various parts of it and be able to add more things, so it gives it more functionality. Whether it's caching for efficiency or multicasting for routing, there are things that are better done in the layers than layer on top and out of it. And I think you're going to see that in the data field as well. So a number of the concerns I have, I could spend an hour on this slide alone. Let me just say, there's potential for a tremendous amount of duplication. A lot of different groups are looking at very similar problems. I've had meetings with people in the medical arena and the financial arena. People are worried about giving identity to legal entities, people who are worried about publications and entertainment, and these, in principle, could all go their own way, come up with different answer standards, but eventually they won't really link together. I mean, you could think in the future that a book has got clickables that lead you to music or, whatever, and you want to really be able to integrate this. So some kind of commonality is really important, and yet every group wants to be in charge of its own interests and do its own thing. So that's one of the concerns. Another question is, what should be discipline-centric? What can be done that's broad and generic? Well, I think semantics in most cases needs to be discipline-specific because they know the terminology. I think metadata schemas want to be specific to different domains. You want to be able to specify the what, but not necessarily the how at these levels. The ability to define what service federations are and what makes sense, that's something you probably want to do in a discipline-centric way. I think identity management requirements probably want to be discipline-centric in many contexts, as well as security and policy development. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that we don't try and do in common what needs to be separate, but what can't or is better off being done in common is done. So that's going to be one of the concerns going forward. Common infrastructure, there are a huge number of things we could list here. Clearly, I would start with standards for identifier resolution. People will have their own identifier systems. I'm assuming we'll have many. In fact, most organizations already have one of some sort, whether it was intended for digital use or not. So we want to make sure that we have standards in place to ensure interoperability at the level of resolution and interpretation. Standards for models of what the data looks like. I tend to use the term digital objects a lot because I think that's a nice generic term. To me, it means data structures that are understandable and parsable by different machines, even though they may resolve to different pieces internally. The ability to access these objects at different levels of granularity, so you don't have to say, give me the whole thing before I can do anything with it. If you just want a blood pressure reading from a medical record, that's all you want to get back, and so forth. I think we need standard interfaces to the repositories and the collections, and so that they can be interoperable. You want to be able to move them from place to place, and we don't want to get into the same kind of rut that we got into with some of the existing protocol structures, where it's taken 17 years to go from the one size of routing address IPv4 to v6, and we never get there worldwide. I think we have other ways that are much better, especially if we build them based on identifiers. So the identifiers can resolve into the right things, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And then finally, interoperability is going to be probably the watchword. We're going to have huge number of identifier systems, huge number of repository capabilities, and we want to make those systems all interoperable. The role of identifiers in this whole thing is going to be critical. I think it is the linchpin. So in one of the systems that we've had on the internet for 20 years, and you probably heard some about, is the handle system. This was actually government supported when we first started it, but it's been out in the field now for about 20 years. It is really bulletproof. Many groups are using it. You probably hear more about it. The publishing community branded it as DOIs. But there's right now one site that is the primary, where all of the so-called prefixes that allow different organizations to separately identify themselves are put into the system, and we've been running that, and there are a lot of mirrors around the globe. And so from a resolution point of view, it's very robust, very reliable, and very rapid and responsive. But increasingly, we're hearing from different groups, and I think the folks at Max Planck were probably instrumental in this, and I give the credit to Peter Wittenberg, who first raised the question, if we're going to use a system like that, what happens if whoever's doing the primary responsibility, something happens and they go out of business, or they change, the personalities change, or something really goes wrong with that, and we agreed to work with him to sort of find a venue or a means that would allow these kind of issues to be resolved. And so what I'm about to tell you really came out of that original initiative. It makes a lot of sense for different countries who might want to use this for internal stuff and want to be sure that they can't be affected by a decision that's made by another country. So we are establishing this foundation in Switzerland. DONA stands, or DONA as some people like to pronounce it, as in prima donna, is the Digital Object Numbering Authority Foundation in Switzerland. It's going to have a multi-stakeholder board drawn from around the globe. We'll start it out with 7 or 8 individuals, some from Africa, Asia, and Europe, the US, and so forth. But there'll be technical and management kinds of folks, people who understand the technical aspects of this. Its main job is going to be to promote interoperability across heterogeneous systems, enabling open architecture. One of the most important attributes of the foundation is to deal with outreach to parts of the world that don't know how to deal with data, maybe don't even have the resources to do it. We're trying to leverage where we can open source kinds of situations, but I wouldn't rule out proprietary ones where they provide more capability that people both want and can afford. This organization will take the responsibility for coordinating the global registry that occurred, that we've been doing all by ourselves for these 20 years. But it won't be responsible for the day-to-day operations. That will be distributed and decentralized around the globe. So there will be, at least initially, probably half a dozen or a dozen different groups doing it. Eventually, I can imagine quite a number more. And the question is then, how do you make sure that all stays coordinated and works together in an effective way? So we're going to give that a shot. We have an implementation out there that we think will stand the test of time, but ultimately it depends on how the people work together, how they coordinate, what policies get put in place, and so forth. So as a concluding remark, I'm just going to say in the last bullet, I think what we're doing with the DONA Foundation is very synergistic with what the RDA is trying to achieve, as I understand it. That's going to evolve over time. The RDA, I think, needs its own independence and its own existence, but to the extent that there's a need to, take ideas that come out of here and make them available to people in other disciplines, to have venues for affecting the evolution of multiple systems. I think the foundation may be a very good partner for working with the RDA in the future. So thank you very much, and give the podium back to you, Alan.
Any questions for Bob? A couple questions. I said it'll be one or two, and then go on to the next speaker. Chris?
I'm interested in what you mean by integration. To some degree, we in the data world tend to focus on the applications layer and trying to solve our problems at that layer. Are you saying we should be working somewhat at different layers, or what do you mean by integration?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I'm just saying that we need both. The reason we introduced the notion of layering with the original networking protocols was because we didn't want everybody working on it to have to understand every one of the layers to figure out where to change things. So we said, okay, here's a nice interface, you build on top of that. But in the future, there are going to be experts that understand about all the different parts of this complex edifice that we're creating, whether it was the older internet or the current internet or wherever it might go in the future. So I'll just do it by analogy. You're not wearing a jacket, but if you were, that jacket would be layered on top of you, right? On the other hand, if we were inventing Chris Greer here in real time, I would not propose to layer your circulatory system on your gastrointestinal tract. It wouldn't be a good idea. Rather, I'd rather integrate the two as part of the whole called Chris Greer, and maybe there were other things we need in there as well. And that's all I'm saying is that within each component of a system that may have layers,
you need the ability to allow for the integration of new capabilities. And I think we can get to a point where it can be a broader thing than just a control element by a small group. I mean, we will hear from Scott about, the IETF. That was something we set up many years ago, and that's where the real expertise was about some of the intricacies of the internals of the Internet. A lot of the work that NSF was doing on the Genie project, as many of you may know, was to find a way to get more participation in some of the internals with slices and ability to deposit code and provide more functionality. I'm just saying that you need the ability to layer on where it's appropriate and to integrate with when that's an appropriate choice. And I'm not trying to give you any rules as to when one is more applicable than the other, just that both are appropriate rather than only layering in every circumstance.